Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 27, Section 1, Unrest in Asia and Africa, and Chapter 27, Section 3, Japanese Imperialism. So before we begin, make sure you have your packet in front of you so that you can fill in the information that you need. So here we go. Number 1, the May 4th movement in China of 1919 was a series of protests and strikes by thousands of angry students who demanded change in the city of Beijing. What's interesting is the date, 1919. If you were perhaps maybe elsewhere in the world, maybe in the city of Moscow, you would know that this was kind of the time of great revolutions, particularly communist revolutions. And really the May 4th movement was kind of a communist revolution that was just starting to start up. One of their leaders was a guy named Mao Zedong, who you see here, and these are some of our May 4th protesters, as you can see pictured below. A few years later, in 1921, the Communist Party was formed in China officially, together with the Kuomintang group. Both groups worked together to fight the warlords from the ancient past who controlled parts of China and were working with the imperialists. The Kuomintang were led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek, who you see pictured on the Time magazine down here. In time, Chiang Kai-shek turned against the communists and eventually began to start a fight that led to a civil war in China that would take place in the 1920s and kind of leading into the 1930s until the Japanese would show up. One of the events that took place during the Civil War was something known as the Long March. And the Long March was a 6,000-mile trek or journey through China led by Mao Zedong for the communists to find a safe place to hide and to regroup. And they did so kind of between 1934 and 1935. And this is roughly about the same time that our Japanese are going to move in and start attacking parts of China. When the Japanese move in during the mid-1930s, what's going to end up happening is that the Civil War is going to kind of come to a halt until after the end of World War II, when it will pick up again and not officially end until about 1949. All right, taking a look at Section 3, Japanese Imperialism. We had mentioned prior to this that Japan had quickly modernized from the time of about the 1850s when Commodore Perry and some of his ships came into Edo Harbor and opened up Japan to trade to the west. And in a very short period of time, Japan went from kind of a medieval nation to a modern nation. Japan changed in the 1920s due to rapid urbanization, meaning a lot of folks moved to the cities. We had a flourishing democracy. We had universal education, so boys and girls were having to go to school. And ideas from the West led to changes in values and politics. After World War I, the Japanese labor force experienced layoffs, strikes, and labor disputes. This wasn't unheard of. If you were looking elsewhere in the world after the end of the First World War, you would have seen this in Europe. Cities like Berlin, Paris, London were all experiencing some of these same problems. For the United States, this isn't really going to kind of really impact us until we get to the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s. And you're going to see some of the same things happening. You know, with the war ending, there was obviously a lot of economic issues that hadn't fully been resolved. And since they hadn't been resolved, we were going to have these economic woes. Two factors that caused the slowdown in Japan's industry were a lack of natural resources. Japan, for the most part, didn't have, for the most part, a lot of iron ore, and so they were having to find that elsewhere. Japan's steel industry, a lot of times what they were doing is buying, old scrap metal, and then eventually, recycling that into new steel. But not too far away over on the mainland of Asia, you had countries like China that had an abundant source of iron ore. And hence, that makes China kind of valuable to the Japanese. We also had a reduction of exports. In the 1920s, many nations, including the United States, had adopted kind of a isolationist perspective when it came to foreign trade. We had high tariffs, and for the most part, that hurt the Japanese industry. They really had a hard time selling their goods abroad. Not only did they have the same problem, but we did too here in the United States. Number 4, Japan's military influence. It grew due to people losing their faith in their government, and they started putting trust into the old military. You got to understand, the military kind of was living under that code of the Bushido that we had talked about. And so people started trusting in the military. Guys like Admiral Yamamoto, in a sense, really saw their status increase during this period of time. And it was a sense of pride to put a lot of trust in the military. Japan's military officers would describe a united Japan as a society devoted to its emperor, who, by the way, was a man named Hirohito, and to the glory of the nation under the rule of military leaders. So, in a way, we're kind of taking a nod to the past, perhaps maybe to the old shogunate days. There were 2 ways that the Japanese isolated themselves, kind of in the 1920s to the beginning of the 1930s, from the Western powers. One, by withdrawing from the League of Nations. Now, I have to admit, the United States wasn't a member of this, but Japan was. And one of the things that members of the League of Nations promised not to do was to wage war. And so Japan backs out of this. And people start wondering, are they up to something? Are they wanting to wage war? Maybe in China. And they also announced that it would no longer agree to any limitations on its naval forces. The United States, in the 1920s, we signed something known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which basically limited the size of our U.S. Navy. We could not have very large ships. We didn't necessarily start building aircraft carriers as a result of this. We weren't building lots of submarines. The Japanese, they backed out of this, and they, for the most part, were able to go ahead and start beefing up their naval forces, building those big ships that one day will become a threat to the United States. The Japanese military leaders also decided to conquer Manchuria. Okay, this is a northeastern part of China, and part of that was to gain resources such as coal and iron that were going to help relieve their reliance on the West. This incident was known as the Manchurian Incident, and it has a lot to do with the Japanese basically saying they needed to invade this area to protect their railroad interest. Truth is, they were going after a little bit more than just control of a railroad. By 1936, Japan and Germany had signed an agreement called the Anti-Comintern Pact. These 2 nations promised to come to the aid of one another if one would be attacked. Okay, this is a kind of another name for an alliance. And so now we have a Japanese-German alliance. This is in the days kind of leading to the beginning of World War II. In 1937, Italy would join this pact. And eventually we're going to rename it to the Tripartite Pact. But I think a lot of people refer to it as the Axis powers. And it's going to be these 3 nations that are going to become the big threat during the Second World War. During the Sino-Japanese War of 1937, Japanese troops went on a murderous rampage, killing at least 100,000 Chinese soldiers and citizens. We're talking men, women, children, in an event known as the Nanjing Massacre. The Japanese, it wasn't like they hadn't been in China by 1937, but when they took over the city of Nanjing, they did so in a very brutal and ruthless way. A lot of times when we think about warfare, we think about soldier versus soldier, and this is different. This event was a situation where our civilians were highly targeted. Women, unfortunately, were brutalized, raped, perhaps, by Japanese soldiers. Children definitely abused. It was an awful time period. And in a sense, this event has caused a lot of tension, even to this modern time, between the Chinese and the Japanese. The Chinese and the Japanese don't get along very well in the present day. And some of it goes back to these events that happened 80 plus years ago. All right. So, as we're leading to the beginning of the Second World War, we probably should take a look at some of the territories that the Japanese, for the most part, were holding at this point in time. As you can see here, this is the Japanese mainland, okay? And we have Korea, the Korean Peninsula, which isn't too far from, obviously, mainland Japan. Manchuria, which we mentioned before, is the region of northeastern China. And this region that you see here, Nanjing, just so you understand, that is like the current day city of Beijing. So we have a very good area here that, for the most part, is going to be in the hands of our Japanese. If you look further west, they had started occupying certain islands. So the island of Formosa, the Marianas, the Marshall Islands, and not too far off into the distance, we're going to have our Hawaiian Islands. To the north, we have the Aleutians that are part of Alaska. These islands are all going to be threatened by the Japanese expansion. All right. Thank you very much.